The part that keeps coming back to me isn't when I first saw him. It's the few seconds before that, when I was sitting in the dark on somebody else's farm looking out through the front window, and I realized the yard had gone too still. I don't mean quiet. Rural places are never really quiet. There's always a fence wire giving a little metallic hum in the wind, or dry grass brushing itself, or some animal moving far enough out that you only hear it if you're already paying attention. This was different. It was like every small sound I had stopped getting anything back from the dark. Like the whole yard had flattened out. I was in an old kitchen chair I had dragged over to the front window because the regular couch in that farmhouse felt like it swallowed you whole. I had my notebook on my knee, the little black one I always carry for work stuff and lists and, for whatever reason, the kind of useless property notes nobody had asked me to keep. Gate on the west side still hanging a little crooked. Deer sign along the north fence, wind picking up from the field behind the barn. That kind of thing. I'd turned the lamp off maybe a minute earlier because the reflection in the glass was driving me crazy. That's when I noticed there was somebody standing out by the edge of the yard. Not moving, not calling out, just facing the house. And what got me, what actually made my hand stop working right on the notebook, was that I had been looking out at that exact stretch of yard off and on for most of the evening. I still don't know when he got there. A friend of mine, Pete, asked if I could stay out at his place for about a week while he and his wife were visiting her sister out of state. It wasn't a dramatic favor. More like, can you keep an eye on things, make sure nobody dumps trash in the drive, maybe run the water once in a while, maybe check the shed because the latch sticks when it rains. It was his father's old livestock property, outside a town that was already small enough that people used directions like turn where the old grain elevator used to be. There hadn't been animals on it in years. The pastures were mostly waist-high in spots. Some of the fencing had gone slack. The barn still stood, but in the way old barns stand when they aren't really barns anymore. More storage and old smell than function. There was a one-story farmhouse with a deep porch on the front, a mudroom off the back, and windows that rattled if the wind hit them from the south. I said yes because I don't mind being by myself. I actually like it. I do maintenance work for county properties, and a lot of that means driving alone, checking things alone, unlocking and locking up places alone. Some people hate that kind of workday. I don't. If anything, I notice more when nobody's talking. And I have habits. My wife makes fun of me for it. If I'm staying somewhere with land, I start keeping notes. Not because I'm some outdoorsman. I'm not. It's just a routine thing. You spend enough years checking fence lines and water pumps and empty buildings, you start writing things down because small changes matter. Even on a property with nothing living on it bigger than rabbits and the occasional deer, I still make notes. Tracks by the trough. Open gate. Bird nest in the electrical box. It gives you a baseline. So every evening out there, I'd sit at the kitchen table or by the front window with my notebook and make a few entries. Half practical, half stupid. Windmill still squeaking once per turn. No vehicle tracks in drive. One raccoon in trash barrel behind shed. Stuff nobody needed. But it kept the place familiar. The farm was isolated enough that once the sun dropped, the house felt like a lit box sitting out in black water. No nearby neighbors. No porch lights in the distance. No traffic except the occasional truck far off on the county road, and even that you heard before you saw it. The first 2 days were exactly what you'd expect. I checked the pump house, walked the inside of the fence closest to the road, found one section where a post had leaned enough that I made a note to tell Pete. Nights were normal. Wind, then no wind. A couple of coyotes somewhere out past the south field. I heated canned chili on the stove, watched half a baseball game with the antenna cutting in and out, went to bed early. The first odd thing was small enough that I almost didn't count it. It had rained overnight, not hard, just enough to soften the ground around the barn and the side yard. In the morning I walked out with coffee and saw a set of footprints in the mud near the barn door. Deep ones, boot prints, from the look of them. Clear heel, clear tread. They came from the direction of the outer fence and angled toward the house before disappearing where the ground turned stonier near the porch. I stood there with the mug warming my hand and just looked at them. My first thought was delivery driver, even though there hadn't been a delivery. Then maybe somebody cutting across the property line. Out there people wander where they shouldn't all the time if they think land is empty. Hunters, kids on dirt bikes, people checking whether a place is occupied. None of that felt good, but it wasn't impossible. And the prints were only one set. No signs of damage, no doors open. I wrote it down anyway. Boot prints near barn after rain, heading house direction. Deep tread, adult size. That night I made sure the doors were locked, more because I felt like I should than because I was actually worried. I remember thinking I was being a little dramatic. I even checked the porch with a flashlight before bed and saw nothing but damp boards and moths throwing themselves at the beam. The thing about a place you're comfortable in, even if it isn't yours, is you let it explain itself. The house creaks because houses do that. The wind hits one corner harder than another. A branch taps. A loose piece of tin on the barn shifts when the temperature drops. You tell yourself the right story, because most of the time the right story is the boring one. That second night I was sitting by the front window again, writing down that I'd seen deer at the back fence just after sundown, when I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow ones, not a burst of movement, not an animal scrambling. One board creaked, then another, with the spacing of someone walking carefully, like they either didn't want to slip or didn't want to make more noise than necessary. I stopped writing and listened. The steps moved from the far end of the porch toward the window. I remember staring at the glass and being annoyed first, not scared. Annoyed because I thought, great, some idiot is out here messing around and now I have to deal with this. The footsteps stopped directly beneath the window where I was sitting. I couldn't see down to the porch from that angle, just the yard beyond, and the reflection of my own shoulder because I still had the lamp on in the other room. I waited for a knock, or a voice. Something normal. Nothing. I sat there maybe 10 seconds, maybe 20. Long enough for my ears to start filling the silence with other little noises. The fridge motor, the tick from the stove cooling off. Then I got up, crossed the living room, and opened the front door fast enough that the screen banged against the frame. Nobody there. The porch was empty. The yard was empty. The air smelled like wet wood and dirt, and the wind had dropped off enough that I could hear water dripping somewhere from the eaves. I took the flashlight from the hook by the door and went a few steps out into the yard. Nothing. No vehicle lights. No movement by the barn. No sound except one insect whining near my ear. I told myself it had to be an animal. Deer can sound heavier than you think on old porch boards if they're stupid enough to come up close. A dog, maybe. I even half believed it until I looked down and saw the damp dust on the porch didn't show any fresh tracks at all. That made me pause. But then I did what people do when they don't want to turn a weird moment into something bigger. I went back inside. I locked the door. I wrote down heard footsteps on porch, no contact, no visible source. Then I watched television too loudly until I felt dumb enough to go to bed. In the morning there were new prints. Not by the barn this time. Around the house. I found them because I took my coffee out and walked the perimeter, telling myself I was only checking because of the rain-soft ground and not because something had gotten under my skin. The tracks started near the back corner by the mudroom, came along the side, crossed the front yard, then continued around the other side toward the windows of the spare bedroom. They weren't random either. They were close to the house, as if whoever made them was staying near the wall. I followed them twice because something about them didn't make sense. There were plenty going around, plenty overlapping where the ground held impressions. But I couldn't find where they clearly left. It looked less like someone had walked up, circled, and gone, and more like the prints simply began in different places around the house and then drifted out into nothing where the grass thickened or the ground hardened. I told myself that's all it was. Inconsistent ground. Bad light. Me looking too hard for a pattern. Still, I went back in and checked all the windows. Then I checked them again. The rest of that day was ordinary enough to almost reset me. I drove into town for gas because the truck Pete left me was low. I bought coffee filters and one of those wrapped gas station sandwiches you regret halfway through. I mentioned to the clerk that people still cut through old farm properties out this way, and he shrugged like of course they do. I came back feeling better. More embarrassed, really. Like I'd turned a drifter or a trespasser into a whole problem because I'd been alone too long. That evening I sat down with the notebook before dinner and flipped back through the previous entries because I wanted to see exactly what I'd written the first morning. And I found something I didn't remember writing. 2 nights earlier, the first full night I was there was an entry down near the bottom of the page in my own handwriting. Possible prints east side after midnight. Recheck in morning. I stared at it for a long time, because it was absolutely my writing. Same cramped way I make lowercase letters when I'm hurrying. Same pressure marks on the page. I had no memory of hearing anything that first night. None. I remembered locking up, watching television, going to bed. That was it, but there the note was, right between a line about the back gate chain and one about the water pressure in the kitchen sink. I tried to explain it in the most harmless way possible. I must have heard something half asleep, written it down in that half-attentive state where you're more muscle memory than awake, and forgotten by morning. I've done versions of that before. Write down milk or call Jim and then see it later with no recollection. Only this wasn't that. I turned back another page. There was a similar line from the night after. Movement near front porch, maybe same prints. That one I remembered a little, or thought I did. Not the event itself. Just the feeling of deciding not to go outside. My mouth had gone dry by then, and I remember setting the notebook down very carefully on the table. Like if I moved too fast, I might confirm something I didn't want confirmed. I walked through the house again. Front room, kitchen, spare room, bathroom, my room, closet doors open, shower curtain back, nothing. I checked the locks, the window latches, the mudroom. Then I stood in the kitchen listening to the refrigerator hum and thought about the simplest version of the story. Somebody had been coming onto the property at night, not to steal anything apparently, not to break in, just close enough to watch the house. That sounds bad enough now. At the time, I still kept trying to thin it out into something manageable. Maybe some local guy knew the place was empty most of the year and wanted to see whether it had company before taking tools from the barn. Maybe he saw my truck and kept circling to figure out who was there. Creepy, yes, but still human, still the kind of thing with a shape to it. That night I left the porch light off. I left every interior light off except the one over the stove, and even that I eventually killed because it was making the window into a mirror. I sat in the front room with the notebook closed on the side table, the flashlight next to it, and the old 12-gauge Pete kept in a locked cabinet now across my lap. I hadn't wanted to touch it, but by then not touching it felt more foolish than using it. I knew it was loaded because Pete had shown me when he first asked me to watch the place. Mostly coyotes, he'd said, though I don't think either of us meant coyotes. Once the house went dark, the outside came forward. The yard wasn't visible all at once anymore, just pieces of it. The pale strip of path from the porch steps, the fence line catching a little moonlight, the darker block of the barn. Beyond that, the property just disappeared. And with the lights off, I became aware of something I hadn't let myself admit before. I had been moving differently in that house all day. Not freely, not casually. I'd been aware of the windows, of where I was visible from. I'd paused before walking past the front room opening. I'd stood to one side when I washed dishes. I'd kept glancing at the glass in the back door without meaning to. Like some part of me had already accepted I might be observed, and my body had adjusted before my mind caught up. That realization sat in my chest like a weight. A little after 10, I heard something near the barn. Not footsteps, more like a scrape, then a pause. Then nothing for so long I wondered if I'd invented it. Then the porch boards creaked, once at the far end, then again closer. My fingers tightened on the shotgun stock hard enough that my knuckles ached. I didn't raise it, I didn't do anything, really. I just sat there breathing through my nose, looking at the window, waiting for a shape to pass through that narrow slice of yard I could still see. The steps came along the porch slower than the night before. 3 boards. Stop. 1 more. Stop. Then silence right outside the window. I kept expecting a face at the glass, or a knock, or the doorknob to move. Something obvious, something I could react to. Instead, there was just that stillness again, that feeling that someone was close enough to touch the wall and choosing not to make the next move. I don't know how long I sat like that before I realized my leg had started bouncing on its own. At some point, the pressure of not knowing got worse than the idea of seeing something, so I leaned forward and reached for the lamp switch beside the chair. Then I stopped. If I turned the light on, I'd blind myself to the yard. If I stayed dark, I might at least see movement. So instead, I got up and moved to the side of the window, keeping out of the middle of it, and looked through the gap in the curtain toward the front edge of the property. That's when I saw him standing at the yard line. Not at the fence. Inside it. Maybe 30 yards out where the grass thinned into dirt. A person-shaped silhouette. dark against dark, but clear enough that it wasn't a post or a tree or my eyes making something from nothing. Tall maybe, though distance was hard to judge. Arms down. Head angled toward the house. He wasn't moving. I remember thinking absurdly, just stay where you are. If you're out there and I'm in here, that's at least a shape I understand. I blinked. I swear to you, I only blinked because my eyes had gone dry from staring. And when I opened them again, he was closer. Not by a step. Not in the way someone advances when you're tracking them and lose the motion. He was just no longer at the yard line. He was near the porch now, close enough that I could make out the vertical line of his body against the lower dark of the house. I made a noise then, not a shout exactly. More the sound you make when your lungs decide before your head does. I jerked back from the window so hard my calf hit the chair and knocked it over. The shotgun came up uselessly toward the glass, and I remember the barrel shaking in a way that made me angry at myself even while it was happening. I wanted to yell, "Who's there? Get off the property," something like that. What came out was just, "Hey." Nothing answered. I edged back to the side of the window and looked again. He was on the porch, just outside the railing near the steps, close enough that if the moon shifted right I thought I might see his face. But I couldn't. The brim of something maybe, or just shadow. What I could see clearly was that he was facing the house. Facing me, probably, though I was no longer in front of the window. And the ground between the porch and where I'd first seen him should have shown a path. The yard was still damp enough to mark. The mud near the porch still held old impressions from that morning. I couldn't see any approach trail at all. That was the point where whatever careful explanations I'd been stacking all week just gave out. My body understood first. My arms went prickly. My mouth dried up completely. There was a hot, sour taste in the back of my throat like I might be sick. I backed away from the window and into the hallway, keeping the gun aimed toward the front room, even though I knew if he came through the door before I heard him, I'd probably miss the first shot. He never tried the knob. That's the thing that feels worst in memory. He was close enough. He had all night. But he didn't rattle the door or throw himself against it or force the issue into something simple. He stayed outside. Now and then the porch would creak once, like a shift of weight. Once I heard a sound near the side of the house, slow and dragging, and I couldn't tell if it was a hand along the siding or just tree branches moving. There were long stretches where I heard nothing at all, and somehow that was worse, because silence meant I had no idea where he was standing. I didn't turn a single light on after that. I stayed in the hallway where I could see both the front room and part of the kitchen, sitting on the floor with my back against the wall and the shotgun across my knees. Every half hour or so I checked the clock on the microwave because it was the only light I let myself keep. 1:14, 2:06, 3:31. Those hours stretched in a way daytime never does. A couple times I thought about making a run for the truck. I didn't do it because I couldn't make myself open that front door. Not with the porch right there. Not with the idea of stepping out into the same dark where he had been standing. The truck was only 20 yards from the house, but 20 yards is a long distance when you think someone has decided to spend the night just outside your walls. So I stayed put. Toward dawn, the house started becoming a house again. The black at the windows softened to gray. Shapes came back. The barn took form. The path appeared. The porch rail separated itself from shadow. I was still sitting on the floor, stiff and cold and feeling older than I had the night before, when the first real bird sound started up somewhere near the back field. I waited until the yard was fully visible before I went to the window. Nobody there. I kept waiting to see the prints. The obvious evidence. The tracks on the porch steps. The churned mud. Something that would at least let me point and say there, that happened there. There was nothing. I opened the door cautiously, then wider. The porch boards were empty and silvered with dew. The mud at the base of the steps looked smooth except for older marks from the day before, softened now by dampness. I walked the front of the house, then the side, then toward the barn. No new footprints, no approach, no exit, nothing circling the house. By the time the sun was up, I had packed my bag, loaded the truck, and left Pete a message that was calmer than I felt. I told him somebody had been on the property repeatedly and he needed to come back or call the sheriff before anyone stayed there again. I did not tell him the part about the missing tracks because I didn't know how to say it without sounding like I'd cracked alone in an empty house. Even now, years later, I still have that notebook. The pages from that week are bent from being handled too much. I went back through them more times than I want to admit, looking for some sign that I'd exaggerated or misread my own entries or skipped something obvious. The footprints near the barn were there. The line about hearing movement before I consciously remembered hearing it was there. The porch that night was there. I've tried to make it human in a way that settles. A trespasser who knew the property better than I did. Somebody using the hard ground and grass to hide their approach. Somebody patient enough to watch a house for no reason I can understand and then leave before daylight erased the proof. But that still leaves the same piece that never fits. If the mud showed no tracks leading away, I still don't know how someone got to that porch on multiple nights without leaving any path behind them. Story 2. The next one feels completely different, and honestly I think that's why it got to me as badly as it did. I knew I needed to leave before I understood why. I was kneeling by the bank trying to break down this stupid second-hand rod I'd bought online. My fingers not working because they were wet and shaking, when I finally looked up at the far side of the pond and realized the fishing line over there wasn't connected to a rod at all. It just ran low across the dark water and disappeared straight into the trees. At the exact same time, I heard branches crack behind me, not one spot, more than one. I had already been talking to this guy for maybe 15 minutes by then, and the whole conversation had felt wrong in that way where you keep telling yourself you're being rude, or weird, or sheltered. But the second I saw that line vanish into the woods like that and then heard movement deeper back where there shouldn't have been anybody else, it was like all the excuses I'd been using just dropped out from under me. The man across from me smiled a little and said, "Real casual. You heading out already?" And I remember standing up so fast my tackle box tipped over into the dirt. I got invited to fish that pond through my mom's friend, Denise. Her brother owned some land way out past the county line, and there was a private pond on it that he mostly used for bass a couple times a year with his friends. Apparently he didn't care if somebody else used it now and then as long as they closed the gate behind them and didn't leave trash. I'd been trying to get into fishing that summer because I needed some hobby that didn't involve my phone or spending money I didn't have. And I was not good at it. I need to be clear about that because it's part of why I ended up there. I had recently bought this bundle of used gear from a guy off a local marketplace listing. One rod, one reel that made a grinding noise if you reeled too fast, a tackle box with random hooks and soft plastics and exactly 2 bobbers, and a folding chair that pinched your fingers every time you opened it. It smelled like somebody's garage. One of the compartments still had old bits of worm dirt dried into the corners. It was cheap though, and I figured I could learn without ruining nicer stuff. I was 22 then, living in an apartment with 2 other guys, and for whatever reason I had this idea that becoming a person who could spend a day fishing alone would also somehow make me calmer in the rest of my life. Which is funny now, because I was never actually comfortable being by myself outdoors. I liked the idea of it more than the reality. The second a trail got too quiet or I couldn't hear a road anymore, I'd start checking my phone even if I already knew there was no service. Still, when Denise told my mom I could use the pond if I wanted, I said yes immediately. Private water sounded easier than embarrassing myself in front of people at a public lake. No one watching me cast wrong. No one seeing me untangle line off YouTube instructions. She gave me basic directions. Turn off the main road onto a gravel lane, go through a cattle gate, follow the rutted track until it dead-ended by the trees. The pond would be about a 10-minute walk from there. She also said there was no signal, which I didn't love, but I told myself it was daytime and private land and I had permission. What exactly was supposed to happen? I went on a Saturday afternoon because I thought that made it less creepy than going early morning or near dark. I threw my gear in my car, stopped for gas station jerky and a sports drink, and drove out there listening to podcasts louder than normal because the roads kept getting emptier. By the time I parked, I was already doing that thing where you reassure yourself out loud. Nice, quiet, good place to practice, nobody around. The walk-in was more isolated than I expected. Dense woods on both sides of the path, not hiking trail woods either. More like unmanaged. Lots of brush and low branches and places where the ground drops off a little without warning. The pond itself was bigger than I pictured, oval-shaped, kind of still, with one decent cleared spot on the bank where people had obviously sat before. Everywhere else, trees crowded the edge pretty close. I set my stuff down, unfolded the chair after pinching myself with it like always, and spent a stupid amount of time trying to threadline because I still hadn't fully figured out that reel. I remember feeling self-conscious even though nobody was there to see me. Then, while I was messing with the hook, I looked across the pond and saw a line already cast from the opposite bank. Just a fishing line stretching out over the water, easy to miss unless the light hit it. There was no movement on it, no bobber, no person standing there. But I could see where it touched the pond maybe 20 yards across. I wasn't thrilled to realize somebody else might be around, but it seemed normal enough. I figured another person had gotten there earlier. Maybe gone back into the trees to deal with something, or maybe left it by accident. People leave garbage and gear everywhere. The fact that I hadn't seen another car by the trail in didn't totally register right away because the track was rough enough there could have been another way in, so I kept setting up. I finally got a cast out that didn't immediately bird's nest my line, and I was trying to look like I knew what I was doing when I heard a voice behind me say, "Not much biting yet." I turned around so fast I almost fell. There was a man standing maybe 15 feet behind me at the edge of the trees. I hadn't heard him walk up at all. He looked like the kind of person you pass at a gas station and then couldn't describe later except maybe middle-aged, baseball cap, work clothes, average build. Nothing theatrical. Nothing movie villain weird. That's part of why I kept talking to him. If he'd looked obviously dangerous, I think I'd have trusted myself faster. He jerked his chin toward the water and said he'd been fishing for a while. I remember glancing past him automatically, expecting to see where he'd been sitting, maybe a cooler or a bucket or something. There was nothing behind him but trees. I said something awkward like, "Oh, okay, cool," because I was still recovering from being startled. He asked if I was out there alone. I laughed a little and said, "Yeah, just trying to learn." I actually held up the rod like proof, which makes me cringe now. He smiled at that in a way that might have been friendly if everything else hadn't felt off. Then he moved a little closer, not in a dramatic way, just the normal amount a person shifts during conversation. Close enough that I could smell cigarette smoke on his shirt, old stale smoke like it had soaked into the fabric. He asked how long I'd been fishing. I told him not long. He asked if I came out there often. I said first time. He looked around the pond while I was answering instead of really looking at me. That was the first moment I felt that drop in my stomach. Not because of anything specific he said, more because being that far from the road in the middle of nowhere, I had this sudden strong awareness that there was no one to casually wave to. No dog walker, no family on the next bank, nobody at all to make the whole interaction part of normal life. I told myself I was overreacting. People talk. That's what people do, especially around fishing spots. Maybe he was just lonely. Maybe he was checking whether I was allowed to be there. So I tried to keep it normal. I asked if he'd had any luck. He said sometimes it's better later, better when the light changes. He took another couple of steps while saying it, looking past me toward the woods behind my bank. I noticed then that he wasn't carrying a rod. I looked at his hands first because I thought maybe he'd set it down, empty. Then I looked around his feet. No tackle box. No chair, no bucket. Nothing. Just him standing there in dirt and leaf litter talking about fishing. I glanced across the pond at that line again and said, "Is that yours over there?" He looked at the water but not really at the line. Then he shrugged and said something like, "Been out there a while." It was a strange answer but still close enough to an answer that I let it go. What I couldn't let go was the distance changing every time I looked away. I would focus on my real or fake focus on the water, and when I looked back up, he was a little closer. Not enough to call out. Enough that I noticed. 15 feet became maybe 12. Then 10. Then he was near enough that I felt like if I took a full step back from the bank, I'd be stepping into his space. I started talking more than I normally would because silence felt like giving something up. I kept explaining my gear to him, saying it was all second-hand, saying I was still figuring out knots, saying I didn't even know if I was using the right bait for that pond. He nodded at weird times like he was only half following it. Then he asked how long I planned to stay. That question changed the air. I know it sounds minor. But there are some questions people ask when they're making conversation, and some they ask because the answer matters to them for a reason you aren't being told. This was the second kind. I pretended to think about it. Said maybe another hour. Maybe less. I mentioned I had stuff to do later, which was a lie. He looked toward the tree line behind me again and said, "You should wait until dark. It's better then." He didn't say better for what. He just smiled a little after, like he'd made a regular suggestion. At that point, I was already rehearsing leaving in my head, but I was also trying not to show it. I don't know if that's a young guy thing or just a scared person thing, where you think being polite might keep the situation from turning into the thing you're afraid it is. I said maybe, and laughed again and crouched to mess with the tackle box because it gave me a reason to break eye contact. While I was down there, I heard something from the woods behind me. A quick movement in dry brush, small enough that I could tell myself squirrel, bird, whatever. But then I looked up and saw the man had turned his head slightly toward that exact sound, like he was checking in on it. That made my skin go tight across my shoulders. I started packing right then, trying to do it casually. I reeled in too fast and the line tangled. My hands were clumsy. The reel made that grinding sound louder than ever. I kept talking while I packed, some nonsense about needing more practice and maybe coming back another time. He said no rush. Still plenty of day left. His tone hadn't changed, but there was something underneath it, some little pressure, like he wasn't asking me to stay as much as measuring whether I would. I stood up with the rod in one hand and tackle box in the other and looked across the pond again, mostly so I didn't have to look at him. That's when I finally saw the line clearly. It didn't angle down to any rod holder or branch. It ran almost level across the edge of the water and vanished into a dark patch of trees on the opposite side, low enough that it looked intentional. Not abandoned, placed. I followed it with my eyes and felt this awful sudden clarity. It wasn't set for fish. I heard movement behind me again. Then off to my left, farther back in the woods. Then somewhere to the right, deeper in. Branches snapping but not running yet, just shifting, positioning. The man was watching me very closely by then, and he said, "You heading out already?" The way he said it, calm and almost amused, was worse than if he'd sounded angry. I dropped the tackle box. It hit the ground and popped open, hooks and cheap plastic lures spilling into the dirt. I didn't even look down. I took 2 steps backward toward the trail, and he took 1 forward, not lunging, just enough that the move felt answered. I said something like, "Yeah, I forgot I have to meet somebody." My voice sounded high and fake in my own ears. He looked past me again toward the same woods where I'd heard the cracking and said, "You drove all the way out here. Be a waste to leave before dark." That was it. Whatever part of me had still been trying to be reasonable finally quit. I left the rod. I literally just let it fall. Then I turned and ran. There's no graceful version of it. I tore straight up the path I came in on, slipping on leaves, getting whipped in the arms by branches because I wasn't staying centered on the trail. I could hear my own breathing too loud, that desperate shallow kind that makes your chest feel too small. Behind me I heard somebody moving, then more than one somebody, hard through brush. Not close enough to grab me, but close enough that I stopped being able to tell whether the sounds were spreading out or gaining. I didn't look back. People always say that, and it sounds dramatic, but in the moment it was practical. I knew if I looked back and tripped, that was it. Also, I didn't want whatever picture was behind me stuck in my head forever. The sounds were enough. At one point, something snagged the back of my shirt and I made this stupid choking noise because for half a second I thought a hand had me. It was just a branch. I yanked free so hard the fabric tore near the shoulder. The path to the car had felt like 10 minutes walking in. Running it felt endless. Every bend looked wrong. Every patch of shade between the trees looked like a person standing there until it didn't. My legs started burning fast because I was not in shape for this kind of sprint, and I remember bargaining with myself out loud. Just get to the gate. Just get to the car. Just get the door shut. When I finally saw the back corner of my car through the trees, I almost cried from the relief of it. I hit the key fob before I was even close enough for it to matter. I grabbed the handle, nearly missed it because my hand was slick, got in, slammed the door, locked it, then fumbled the keys so badly I dropped them between the seat and the console. Those few seconds felt longer than the whole run back. Something moved at the tree line to the left of the clearing. Not fully out, just enough that I knew I wasn't alone out there. I got the key in, started the car, and backed up rough enough to spit gravel. I didn't do the careful turnaround I'd done when I parked. I just whipped it around in the clearing and tore back down the track, branches scraping both sides of the car. I kept expecting to see someone in front of me on the road, or at the gate, or in the mirror. I did not look in the mirror. Not until I hit the main road. When I finally did, there was nothing behind me except dust. I drove all the way into town before I pulled over, and even then I only stopped because my hands were cramping on the steering wheel. I sat in a grocery store parking lot with the act blasting and realized I had left almost everything there. The rod, the reel, the tackle box, the chair, my sports drink, even my hoodie. I called my mom first, which tells you exactly how old I really was despite trying to act like some independent outdoors guy. Then I called Denise and told her I was sorry, but something was very wrong out there and she needed to tell her brother not to let anyone go alone. I didn't tell the story well because I was still in that stage where you worry you're making too much of things. Man at pond. Other people in woods. Felt like a setup. Denise was quiet for a long second, then said her brother hadn't told anyone else they could be out there that day. I never went back for the gear. I didn't care. It was all cheap and used anyway, but even if it had been expensive, there was no chance I was driving back down that lane to retrieve it. Not for a rod. Not for pride. Nothing. I've thought about that fishing line more than anything else. Because if it had just been the man, there'd still be explanations I could live with. Creepy guy. Trespasser. Somebody trying to scare me for fun. But that line across the pond, low and fixed, leading right into the trees, and the way he kept asking how long I'd stay, and the way there were other sounds in the woods exactly when he told me it would be better after dark, all of that felt like parts of one thing, and I still can't figure out what that thing was supposed to be. If that line wasn't for fishing, then why put it across the water at all? And who exactly was moving out there when he told me to wait until dark? Story 3. The last story is the one that still bothers me in a way the others don't, because this one followed me inside before I even knew there was an inside to follow. I was already backing toward the front door when the person in the corner said my name. Not loudly, not like a shout from across the room. Just in a regular voice, almost conversational, like we were in a space we both belonged in and I was the one making it strange. The room was at the end of a short hallway I could have sworn I'd already checked. The door was open now and the overhead light in there was off, so I was only seeing part of it from the hallway glow behind me. A standing lamp in the corner unplugged. A narrow bed or maybe a day bed against one wall. Some stacked boxes. And in the far corner where the darker paint met the shadow, somebody standing with their face turned toward the wall. Not moving. I had stopped just long enough to register that shape as a person when they said my name without turning around. Every muscle in my body went tight so fast it almost felt like getting cold water dumped on me. My laptop bag slid off my shoulder because I'd forgotten I was still holding the strap, and the sound of it hitting my leg made me jerk even harder. I didn't ask who was there. I didn't say what the hell. I did the only useful thing I could think of, which was get loud and move forward instead of freezing in place. Hey. It came out sharp and meaner than I usually sound. Then louder. Get away from the front. Move back. I don't know why I chose those words exactly, except that I suddenly understood I did not want whoever was in that house getting between me and the exit. If I ran first, and they moved at the same time, we'd be meeting in that hallway. So I stepped toward the open door instead, one hand out like I was warding off a dog, the other already reaching behind me for where I knew the front entrance was. The figure shifted, not fast, just enough to show they'd heard and were responding. I shouted again, louder, and this time there was enough force in my own voice that it changed something. The person moved deeper into the room, not toward me. I took that second and backed hard down the hallway, grabbed the front doorknob, yanked it open, and got outside so quickly I almost missed the top step. Then I pulled the door shut from the outside and jammed the lock.
I know that sounds useless, locking someone inside the place you're escaping from. But I wasn't thinking strategically. I was thinking barrier. One more thing between me and that hallway. I got to my rental car, got in, hit the lock button 3 times like that would do extra, and called the booking platform, then the property owner, then the local non-emergency line, all while staring at the front windows of the house and waiting to see if anybody would appear behind the glass.
Nobody did. To explain how I got there, I need to tell you 2 things about me. First, I travel for work more than I want to. Not influencer travel, not fun. I coordinate training visits for a medical software company, which means every few months I'm driving to some regional office or clinic or temporary setup nobody else wanted to cover, staying 1 or 2 nights somewhere I didn't choose because it was the only option within reasonable distance. Second, because of that, I have a habit. The second I arrive at a rental, I document everything. Every room, every scratch on furniture, every stained towel, weird lock, cracked tile, smoke detector hanging sideways, all of it. I started doing that after getting blamed once for damage that was already there. Since then, I walk in, set my bag down, and take photos before I even fully unpack. It's automatic now. Front room, kitchen, bathroom, bedroom, hallways, windows, thermostat, entry points. If something later feels off, I want a timestamp. The trip in question was one of those last-minute work things. A clinic outside a small town needed an on-site system handoff because the remote training had gone badly, and everybody else on our team either had kids or status or a spine. So I drove out there on a Thursday afternoon in late fall and booked the only decent-looking place within half an hour of the clinic. It wasn't a hotel. It was a rental house on a remote piece of property, listed as Peaceful Countryside Retreat, which usually means cheap furniture and no soundproofing. The photos online showed a renovated little farmhouse or maybe a guest house. White walls, clean counters, generic art, nice enough. It was also far from everything which I didn't love, but I only needed one night and had an early meeting the next morning. The drive-in got progressively more empty, then turned onto one of those roads where mailboxes are clustered because the houses are too spread out for individual delivery. The rental itself sat at the end of a gravel spur with a patch of yard, a detached shed, and fields on two sides. No immediate neighbors that I could see. Just trees beyond the property line and a low fence that looked decorative more than useful. When I arrived, it was still light out. The house looked normal. Clean windows. No extra cars. Key in the lockbox where the instructions said it would be. I remember specifically feeling relieved because I'd spent the whole drive half expecting a disaster listing situation, and instead it seemed exactly like the pictures, if a little more tired in person. I carried my overnight bag in, set it by the sofa, and did what I always do. Photos first. Living room from the doorway, kitchen counters, stove, under the sink because people are weird about water damage, bedroom, closet, bathroom, hallway, little desk nook by the window, entry door, back door. There was a short hallway off the living room with 3 doors, bathroom on the left, bedroom at the end, and one narrow door on the right that I remember assuming was either an owner's storage closet or utility space. In my memory, that right side door was closed when I walked past it. Not noteworthy, just closed, like lots of locked-off spaces are in rentals. I finished the photo routine, hauled my bag into the bedroom, plugged in my laptop, answered 2 work emails, and then went back through the pictures while eating crackers out of one of those little travel snack bags from the gas station. That's when I noticed the hallway photo. The narrow door on the right wasn't fully closed in the picture. It was open maybe 2 inches, just enough to break the line of the frame. I stared at that image longer than it deserved because I was almost certain it had been shut, not because I'd checked it specifically, just because that kind of thing is what my brain catalogs in rentals. Open, closed, locked, available. Not available. I tried to replay my arrival in sequence and couldn't, so I did the reasonable thing and dismissed it. Maybe I'd nudged it with my bag. Maybe air pressure from the front door had moved it. Maybe I saw it half open in person and my brain later corrected it to closed because that's what I'd expect from a storage room. None of that felt alarming, just mildly annoying in the way unfamiliar houses can be. I actually laughed at myself a little and went back to work. By evening, I had showered, changed into a t-shirt and sweats, and set my bag on the little desk by the living room window so I could organize paperwork for the next morning. The house had that rental smell that clean places sometimes have, not dirty, just too many different detergents under the same roof. The heater kicked on with a dry metallic smell each time it cycled. Outside it was already fully dark, and the windows reflected the room so clearly they were almost useless. At some point around then, I walked past the hallway again and noticed the narrow door was fully closed. That stopped me for a second. I hadn't touched it. I was sure of that now because once I'd seen the photo I had made a mental note to leave it alone, mostly to prove to myself I was overthinking it. But there it was, shut tight enough that the latch was seated. Again, there were possible explanations. The heater, drafts, old frame settling. I even went over and lightly tested the knob without opening it. It turned a little, then stopped, like it was either locked or sticking. I let it go. Or I tried to. About 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't know. "You missed a room." That's all it said. No introduction. No name. I remember the exact physical sensation of reading it, because everything in me sort of pulled inward at once. My throat tightened first, then the back of my neck, like my body was bracing before I had a reason to justify it. I checked the booking app, thinking maybe the host had messaged from a personal number for some reason. There was nothing there. No recent messages besides check-in instructions. I looked back at the unknown text. No area context I recognized immediately. No emoji, no smile, nothing to signal a joke. Then I looked up from the phone and realized I was standing almost exactly in line with that hallway. I called out, "Hello," mostly because silence suddenly felt like participation. Nothing answered. I texted back, "Who is this?" The reply came almost immediately. "Blue bag by the window." Not the safest place for it. I turned and looked at my bag on the desk. That detail was not visible from outside. Not from the driveway. Not from the listing photos. Not from the front windows unless someone had been close enough to press against the glass, and I would have seen that because it was dark enough outside to turn the windows into mirrors unless you were right on top of them. I checked the front door lock. Deadbolt engaged. Back door too. Then I did a fast sweep of the visible rooms, suddenly much less interested in seeming rational. Kitchen, bathroom, bedroom, under the bed, shower curtain, back closet. My heart was beating so hard by then that I could feel it in my face. Nothing. I called the host. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Same result. I considered leaving immediately. I should have. But this is the part where being used to handling things alone worked against me. My brain shifted into procedural mode. Confirm entry points. Confirm whether the text is a prank. Confirm whether the host has cameras or a groundskeeper or some stupid explanation involving another building on the property. I checked the listing carefully for mention of owner suite, attached unit, caretaker, anything. Nothing. Another text came in. Hallway. Just that one word. I wish I could tell you I left right then. I didn't. I picked up a heavy ceramic lamp base from the end table, because it was the nearest solid thing, and I walked toward the hallway. Slow. Listening. The house was quiet in a bad way. Not peaceful. Pressed. The heater had cycled off, and without it there was no mechanical sound at all, just the small friction noises of me moving in clothes that suddenly seemed too loud. The narrow door on the right was open, not 2 inches. Open enough that the dark inside formed a clean rectangle. I stopped maybe 6 feet away. There was no light on in that room, but the hallway light reached in just enough to show shapes. A corner of a mattress or cot, stacked storage bins, a coat hook on the wall, and a person standing in the far corner facing the wall. My first thought wasn't human, weirdly. It was that something had been draped there. A coat, a pile, some trick of depth. Then the shoulders shifted with a breath. I froze, and then they said my name. Not Miss Whatever from the reservation. My first name. The one attached to the booking, yes, but hearing it from inside a room I did not know existed inside a house I had rented alone did something to my ability to think in a straight line. What snapped me out of freezing was the layout. I knew where the front door was behind me. I knew the hallway was too narrow for both of us to move through comfortably if they came out fast. I knew I could not let surprise make the decision for me. So I got loud. I said, "Get back. Get away from the front. I have called the police." All of it in that hard-clipped voice you use when you need to sound like a person with backup even if you're absolutely alone. I took one step toward the hallway opening as I said it, swinging the lamp base up a little like I'd throw it. the person moved deeper into the room. That's still one of the strangest details to me. They didn't rush me. They didn't plead. They didn't explain. They retreated farther into the dark like the confrontation itself wasn't the point anymore. I backed out, got the door, got outside, locked it, and ran for the car. From there, things became practical again. Call platform. Call owner. Call local law enforcement. Give address. Stay on the line. Watch windows. The host finally answered on my third call, sounding confused and then offended and then scared in that order. He insisted nobody should be in the house, that there was no shared occupancy, no caretaker staying on site, no relative with access. He kept asking if I was sure. I said, "There is a person in your house who knows my name." That seemed to get through. A deputy arrived maybe 20 minutes later, though it felt longer. Another vehicle after that. They went in, checked the rooms, opened the shed too. One of them asked me to walk through what happened, and even while I was doing it, I could hear how thin parts of it sounded. The photo, the text, the door position, the person facing the wall. They found the room, obviously. It was not on the listing. It was a narrow side room off the hallway that had been painted to blend with the wall line in some of the promotional photos, or at least photographed in a way that made it easy to overlook. Whether that was deliberate on the listing or just flattering angles, I couldn't tell. The deputy said it looked like storage that had been partially set up for someone to stay in temporarily. Bedding, water bottles, a power strip, no person, no bag with ID in it, no clear explanation. Which was almost worse, because if I had imagined it, there would have been nobody. If I had misunderstood, there would have been some obvious harmless answer, but the room was real, and it had signs of recent use, and whoever had been in that corner was gone by the time law enforcement got there. The texts came from a prepaid number that went nowhere after that. The host swore he had no idea who'd been accessing the property. The deputy asked whether anyone could have learned my name from paperwork in the house or from outside through a window. Maybe. In theory, but not before I even noticed that room, and not along with where I'd put my bag unless they had been watching me inside. I didn't stay the night, obviously. The platform moved me to a hotel closer to town, and I still barely slept, because every time the hallway outside my room got footsteps, my whole body tensed before I was awake enough to remember where I was. The next morning I went to my work meeting anyway, because that's the kind of stupid professional thing people do, like if you keep the calendar intact, then reality has to stay in its lane. I wore the same blazer I'd thrown over my t-shirt in the car the night before. I did a system handoff presentation while feeling like there was grit under my skin. Afterward, I went back through the arrival photos again and again. In the hallway image, the door is cracked open. Yes. In another, taken from farther back, there is a sliver of darkness where there shouldn't be one. And in the reflection on a framed print near the living room entry, there is what might be nothing, or might be a shape where no shape should be. I don't show people that one because once you start asking others to confirm shadows, you've already lost the argument. I still document every rental when I arrive. More carefully now. I check wall lines, count doors, open anything that isn't clearly locked. I don't leave my bag in the first room anymore. And if a place feels even slightly staged in a way I can't account for, I leave before I unpack. Because what I still can't get comfortable with is not just that someone was in that house. It's that whoever was standing in that hidden room knew my name, knew where I had put my bag, and knew enough about my movements inside that place to tell me I had missed a room before I even understood it was there.